Welcome to the Explorers Podcast with Ken Bowen. Here, Ken connects with friends and peers to discuss issues in the world and practices to improve one's biblical perspective.
This is Ken Bowen, and welcome to Explorers, and I'm with my special guest, John Stonestreet of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And John and I have been friends for a number of years, going back to the days when they had the Centurions program, if you'll recall that. And I don't know, when was that? Did that start, John, in 2004, somewhere around there?
Yeah, I think I think that's probably right. I mean, Chuck Colson wanted to pass on a legacy to leaders, and that was the program that he started.
That's right. And it was really quite remarkable. And I enjoyed getting to know you and the other people. That's where I also met Glenn Sunshine, because he and I were both invited by Chuck to participate in that. And I used to, after a while, start teaching movies as well. You remember that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Where I'd do a little overview and they'd have popcorn. So I did things like The Shawshank Redemption and Gladiator and The Matrix, and it's a Wonderful Life, and all these wonderful films to pull out the themes that relate to a worldview. But so we've been journeying together for a good while, and I've missed you.
Well, you too, and that's the journey of film and worldview is part of my story too. Before I started working with Chuck Colson, I led a group out of a small Christian college where we traveled around to youth groups and Christian schools and introduced different worldviews using films and songs and TV programs. And it, of course, American Christian culture, a lot of times back then it just basically rejected that everything worldly is bad and didn't engage it. And that approach to engagement was a big part of our story.
Yes, that's right. So you actually caused people to see it with new eyes, with a larger lens, and helping people.
Well, that was the goal. I'm not sure I always succeeded. It was the goal.
Yeah, it's an ambitious goal. It is. Yeah. But in training oneself to see and using those kinds of creative endeavors, and the arts and so forth, to realize and reveal the human condition. That of alienation, of loneliness and isolation, that's some of the things we're seeing even now in our time. And there are different films that bring out different components. Yeah. Like I remember teaching The Problem of Evil, and the best example I could use was Woody Allen's Crimes and Misdemeanors. It's the best setup I've ever seen.
Oh, yeah.
He didn't have the solution, but the God who gives you guilt also took your guilt and gives you, the God who gives meaning gives you. But we've been talking about a number of things over these processes, and I've been evaluating a number of cultural factors I want to run by you.
Okay, that sounds good.
So, I have a list of 8 that I've just collected recently, and I want to just get your thoughts on them. The first, number 1, is critical thought, identity, politics, and postmodernity. And it's kind of like, obviously, it's a whole volume in each one of these, but where do we begin?
I think that's exactly right. So in 2002, I heard a very prominent, popular Christian author, theologian, and apologist say that postmodernism was dead. And his argument was that it was dead because of 9/11, and 9/11 made it obvious that there were absolute evils in the world and things weren't all relative. And I remember hearing that and thinking, I don't think that's right, because I think when you're looking at evil through a postmodern lens, which I thought had already been pretty firmly embedded by that time, thanks to the 90s in American pop culture.
Yes.
You're going to look at 9/11 and not say absolute evil exists, but you're going to say, oh, people that believe in absolute good and evil are the ones who did this. Yes. And the problem is that belief in absolutes. Well, fast forward, 30 years or 20 years, and here we are. And I think you're absolutely right in that observation, Ken, to connect critical thought. I call it the critical theory mood, mainly because no one's read The Critical Theorist, but that mood.
That's true.
Right,
yes,
but it's true of postmodernism, right? Who had read Derrida or Foucault?
Yeah, Foucault, yeah. I mean, not many were going to read
those.
No,
but we had The Matrix, and we had Kurt Cobain, and we had Britney Spears, and we had Eminem. And so the mood was very much there. And obviously we're seeing it, here the week we're recording it, the protest that are taking place on these college campuses about Israel, and calling the good guys the bad guys through this lens of oppression, oppressor. And that, of course, is a Marxist child, a grandchild, stepchild of postmodernity. And the critical theory mood, I think, is a dominant feature of our cultural moment, and how people see each other and see the world.
I think it's alive and active, and essentially the construction of people who are oppressed versus those who are not oppressed, then suddenly demonizing those who are not oppressed, and then absolutizing their goodness of those who are, is a strange thing that contra facts. It just contrary to all facts and evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, that's right.
And nevertheless. Yeah.
One of the moments where I realized just how predominant it was, I was talking to a member of Evangelicals and Catholics Together. This was a group that Chuck Colson helped to initially put together.
Remember.
And a theologian from New England. And we were just talking about this. And she said, I have a friend who teaches junior high here in I think it was Boston. And the conversation came up, how many of these junior high kids identify as LGBTQ? And her answer was, all of them do. And she said, all of them? Are they having sex? And she was like, oh, no, absolutely not. So how can they identify in these categories if they're not actually active in that area? And you know what the answer was, Ken? The answer was, because nobody wants to be cis or straight anymore. So you see, suddenly being non-oppressed, as you put it, is I don't want to be that, because to be oppressed is to be morally superior. It's to be cool. It's to be accepted.
Precisely
and,
so.
I thought, if that's trickled down to the junior high level when it comes to sexual identifications, it's pretty firmly embedded in the American experience.
Indeed it is. And as well, we've seen together in art in the last few decades, really, the movement away from empirical evidence as a vehicle for any form of knowledge, and rationality as well. So when you divorce yourself from reason and from evidence, from those two dimensions, you're freed or firmly planted in midair.
I love that phrase. And I actually wanted to have this conversation with you today, Ken, because, one of the things I was blown away by was the breadth of topics that you spoke about with the during the Centurions program, and all your books. Your book, Faith Has Its Reasons, was a big part. I mean, I assigned that in classes that I taught at the college level. What a remarkable work. And you're tracing really the history of apologetics. And, we all remember the good old days, right? where Christians were the ones of being accused of being kind of disconnected from reality. We're too heavenly minded, so we're no earthly good. Right. And science has the answer. And now, fast forward to 2024, and we're the ones going, hey, you have a body. And your physical body actually matters. And your parts actually tell you something true about the world.
Precisely.
Who had this on their bingo card back in, when you wrote Faith Has Its Reasons?
You would never dream it. And the idea that all of a sudden that there is no ideology trumps biology is an incredible category. So when that occurs, again, you are not, it's just the only authority you have is the autonomous self. And that's not much of an authority. And then it just goes from there, where people, though, because they don't have a true identity, then embedded in a collective ethos and zeitgeist.
Okay, so I want to throw in then one of my observations about the culture, and I want to hear what you have to say about this, because of the result of the autonomous self. Now, again, we're old enough that this was being said by Disney films back in 1990 or 1980. You have different, obviously you had the philosophers, the Jean-Paul Sartres of the world, saying it kind of, where the growth of existentialism in the middle of the 20th century as one way of kind of responding to what was happening. But it was kind of this theoretical push. Here's what I've been thinking about, Ken. The parable of the madman, Nietzsche's parable. One of the two places he was really wrestling with this idea of God is dead, which he's known for. The other one being Thus Spake Zarathustra, where he's really more making the case for the death of God as a good thing and a way for humanity to advance. But in the
Right.
parable of the madman, he's really warning the other atheist about optimism and this kind of, obviously the progressive vision, the utopianism that was really dominant at the end of the 19th century, and saying, look, if God is dead, we don't know what up and down is. Remember that phrase in there? The madman goes on this rant, and he's like, are we not now straying us through an infinite nothing? Aren't things becoming darker and colder? And then, of course, the parable ends where the madman basically says, oh, I've come too soon. This is what's going to happen with the death of God, but these guys aren't ready to hear it.
I think that's precisely right, that it was an anticipatory understanding of where we've now come to the banality and the horror of a world in which there is no nexus for meaning, purpose, hope, identity, or context for any kind of trust or relationship.
Is that so? I've really been thinking about this, and part of it goes to about 15 years ago, a British newspaper did a survey of young people and asked them, does life have meaning? And 9 out of 10 said yes. They didn't agree. It wasn't like, what is the meaning of life? And do they all agree? It was just, does life have meaning? 10 years later, the same newspaper, same age demographic, does life have meaning? 1 out of 10 said yes. Now, and again, that's a small sample, but you think about the suicidality, you think about the deaths of despair that were exaggerated, not exaggerated, but made worse during COVID, the isolation, the lockdowns, the mental health crisis that we've read associated with both TikTok and smartphones and all of that. And I guess what I've really been thinking about, we were talking about the connection between atheism and meaninglessness on a theoretical level for a really long time. Like, hey, if there's no God, you don't have a source for meaning. It feels like we've moved from theoretical to existential. Like,
I think that's right.
Like, people are really feeling this.
Mm-hmm. They are now embedded in this isolation, this narrative of that's amplified by a wide array of other new forces that really couldn't have been fully predicted. Even with the 2007, suddenly we have the internet in our hands. We have the smartphones and the radical changes that's made. And all of these things are related together because indeed Nietzsche understood this and saw that the general populace will not be ready for that understanding. But the idea of the Übermensch and the idea of some kind of a new morality that transcends. But in our myth of Sisyphus, we're trying to achieve something that is going to be doomed for destruction because it's corroded by the acids of its own assumptions.
I've thought about that a lot with young people. And we, obviously in the last 3 years have seen the spike of mental illness among young people, despair, suicidality. And you think of the pressure that young people have to construct the world.
Yes. I mean, they don't have the materials to work with. They don't have, because they have basically a skeptical understanding of life because it's suspicious about any authority other than the autonomous self. And as a consequence, you don't have the materials to work with. But yet they're actually more vulnerable, though, to a collective ethos that isn't thought through, but just kind of gained by osmosis. And that makes me think about a couple of things about that osmotic condition. Let me read a little list I've got. And as we do this, I want you to think about how each of these relate to each other, and they also reinforce one another. And there's a collective tsunami that's taking place that I find is absolutely unprecedented in a number of ways. So the first we talked about is the critical thought, identity politics, postmodernity. But then the second one is mediaization, intercultural imbecility, as I call it. That's the second one. Then the third one is AI and immersion in dark, doubtful digital spaces. A fourth one is the vapidity of social media. It's that there are people with thousands of friends who have no friendships. And then the fifth one is collective, what I call a strange term, collective autism, a collective apathy a collective amnesia, and a collective anger. You know I like alliteration, John.
You can't shake that Baptist out of you, can you?
I'm sorry. I can't get it out of me. It's hardwired in my system, I'm afraid. But autism, by which I mean that people are no longer comfortable with having a personal encounter, but rather it's got to be mediated through other devices and things without even the ability to look into another's eyes and have an effect. So but apathy, amnesia, and anger as well. A kind of a victimhood. Then number 6 is degeneration of culture carriers, and you can take anything you wish and do a decade by decade study of film or television or popular media. And then my 7th one is globalism as a mandate, a cultural mandate. And then the 8th one is the redefinition of sexuality and loss of boundaries. So I see them each as reinforcing one another to some degree. They're independent in some respects, but they're cognate in others.
Yeah, there's so many thoughts that come to mind. The first 3 obviously make you think of Neil Postman, and what would Neil Postman, if he were alive right about today? He basically said back in 1985 that TV makes us dumb. And then of course that's followed with the news makes us now dumber the more the news becomes entertainment and less actually factual. To move on in terms of the social media and the danger of that, we talked about kind of the pressure. So many of these things come back to whether the world is created and there are givens, or to the postmodern idea, everything is socially or has to be socially constructed, including our identity. And I just wonder, we thought that, a belief in God and all the things that came along with that, like moral norms and just creational norms, that these things were oppressive. And it turns out that a world where there are no givens is unwieldy. Like it just becomes too heavy. It's like putting the weight of the world on our shoulders, and we're not God. We can't carry that. And to not have any givens means that so many things are up in the air. So the media and social media, I mean, look, on a practical level, I think it's so interesting right now that we have people saying, look, if your kid just even this week, I've heard this over and over, and I would agree, if your kid goes to a school that allows smartphones, you've got a school that is just ridiculous. Like, change schools now.
Precisely so, because isn't it interesting? The people who created these devices, like the iPad and others, are the ones who say, "I don't have my kid."
Absolutely,
they know. They know
better. I always appreciated too, Ken, about your sessions, that this connection between here's what's kind of globally happening on a worldview level, and here's the virtue that you need to practice.
Yes,
and I think we have a hard time sometimes as a church, kind of going back and forth between kind of personal behavior and how that fits. And so many of these things require Christians to be, I'll quote Tom Holland, the historian, the British historian, who I find fascinating. I'm sure you do too.
Yes.
He was in a conversation talking about what he'd learned from the history of the church and what that means for today. And he said, well, modern Christians need to stay weird. And I just love that line.
The contramundum. It's counterintuitive. It's countercultural. It's always been so.
Yeah.
So
we thought we're supposed to be kind of relevant, and we were supposed to be kind of missional in a way that we don't create too many obstacles. And turns out maybe we should be really weird.
That's correct, because the ideal, the ideation behind being relevant is to reach out to more people, but the attempt to be relevant will almost systematically eliminate your uniqueness, the power of your message, because now it just becomes a Christian veneer, a surface, a patina on a cultural ethos that is utterly anti-Christian, and people tried by being relevant. And remember what Chuck Colson used to see: a lot of theologians are sporting theological bell bottoms. You remember he used to?
I don't remember that one. That's a great one.
It's a great image.
It is.
Yeah. Nehru jackets and bell bottoms. You had to be old enough to remember those crazy things. But the fact is that in attempt to be relevant, you consign yourself to the bin of perpetual irrelevance. You're a bubble on the back of culture, always trying to catch up, but you're always behind, because you're not taking the biblical transcendent vision of a top-down view. And there are 4 questions that people find. I find it's astonishing that people, John, can go for decades without asking these 4 questions. Where did I come from? Who am I? Why am I here? And where am I going? The fundamental question of where I came from is a question of meaning, because and most people don't connect the idea of meaning without a transcendent, infinite, personal, ultimate. There's no basis for meaning. We're just an episode between 2 oblivions. And then identity is the second question. Who am I? And am I defined by the world, or am I defined by the word? And then the third one is purpose. Why am I here? And again, where do I get my message? And then finally, where is my hope? And amazingly, and you know people who can go for decades without even thinking about these questions.
Yeah.
And maybe the only time that they're forced into it is when they have the pain of going to a funeral.
Yeah, that's right. Well, but I do wonder if kind of the veneer of the kind of the amusing ourselves to death that Postman talked about, given how harmful this is, as entertainment has morphed into more and more privatized viewing and living experiences, some of those existential questions are again being forced on people, I think. And I think throughout most of history, it was kind of impossible to deny the existential questions. And then kind of modernism kind of built up all these toys and distractions and ways of living that basically shielded us from it. But it's kind of like, I forget who first came up with this, but I've always loved that analogy of being in a pool with beach balls and you're trying to push the beach balls below the surface and they keep popping up.
Yes.
That
you can't keep it from happening.
You can. Yeah. And I think that that there's so many examples of that right now, whether it's a global pandemic or what we learned about our authorities during the global pandemic. I think another big existential question is, who can I trust? Where do I look for trust?
So who do I trust? And the isolation, loneliness, and alienation, so a fundamental loss of trust and a fundamental alienation becomes so increasingly characteristic of people.
Yeah.
And they don't have a question. They're lost in the cosmos, as Walker Percy used to put it. The idea of they don't have but unless there's something that's, here's and you know this, people, the non-theist always lives better than the logical implications of his non-theistic presuppositions. He cannot help it because of the imago Dei. He's hardwired. He's God-haunted, whether he likes. Even with now Richard Dawkins. Now he's a cultural Christian.
I want to ask you about that too. I mean, we have talked for years about how I always called them the grumpy Brits. There was this group of British authors. Of course, there were the new atheists that were just kind of going after Christians for a long time. But I mean, like Theodore Dalrymple. And Melanie Phillips and some others that were writing about the loss of culture and how it was a bad thing.
Yes.
And then suddenly there's this resurgence between Tom Holland. I know Ayan Hirsch Ali is not a Brit, but certainly coming out of a radical Muslim childhood into a an atheist worldview, and now calling herself a Christian.
That's right.
And look, I think you got to have the substance, not just the fruit. You got to embrace the root, not just the fruit, to get all the goods of Christianity. But are the Brits ahead of us again? Are there a group of these Europeans that are looking back and maybe they've seen more about the loss of civilization? You talked about the loss of culture. I mean, these guys were writing about this from a context. And I think one of the interesting factors of this too, Ken, is that and certainly in Britain, but you can look through most of Europe, there was more of a divide between high culture and low culture, between like the arts and entertainment. Of course, America, that's always been kind of weirdly blurred.
Indeed. Yes, indeed.
But when you start to see the degradation of culture, when you start to see the literally calling evil good and good evil, which we've seen in such real ways over the last 10 years, intentional harm done to children and calling that healthcare. It feels like some of these guys are going back even Bill Maher in the US, I find myself agreeing with on, more than I had predicted. Are they onto something here?
Yeah, they're onto something, because essentially the British are part of a context, a European understanding of history that's more broad and deep, and ours is a thinner understanding that's derivative. And so I think that they have almost hardwired in the structures and institutions of their culture certain collective understandings that were evoked by a Christian ethos, a Christian sentiment for 1,000 years would have dominated from the 6th century to the 16th century, especially, where it was the default understanding of the world, which then, as you well know, changed from theism, but not to materialism directly, but by way of deism as a median, so there wouldn't be as much cognitive dissonance. But at the end of the day, now a mere physicalism and materialism. But again, the non-believer can't live consistently with that because they're haunted by the meaning issues of life. And so they have that. I think it's in their DNA in Europe more than we have it in our culture here. They have a greater sense of their history and the greatness as they look at their own cathedrals and their own the greatness of the art that was evoked by two sources of beauty. The first source of beauty is the beauty of God's world, which is, and it's through beauty that God approaches us, and it's the Spirit of God who points to the Son of God, so the beauty points to the truth, and the truth of the Word, the beauty of the Word is the second source of beauty, and then the third source of beauty, as I see it, is our response to both the world and the Word, the beauty in the world and beauty in the Word, in the sciences, in the arts, and in worship. And so that's a derivative form, but it's a third demonstration that the goodness of the Father. So it moves from beauty to truth to goodness in that respect.
Yeah,
it's an interesting development.
Well, yeah, and I think that that conversation apologetically, I don't want to say took a turn. I think we've always wrestled with, is Christianity true? But there was a real sense too where it went on to, is Christianity good? And a lot of these guys are going back going, well, it's better than the alternatives we see looking around,
And that's Dawkins' conclusion.
Yeah.
Basically, he says it's not that I see I'm a Christian in the ethos of it, the understanding, but I like what it's done.
Yeah.
It's produced, and it's undeniable that it has in fact produced things that the world has not seen before. The very educational systems, the eleemosynary systems, their hospitals, the orphanages, the nurseries, all these things were evoked by a Christian ethos, not just architecture and art and music, but all the other components as well. So they're onto something. They know that this is a worldview that comports with the human condition.
Yeah. I think that there's a part of their kind of scientific explanation of the world that explains away human exceptionalism. But when you actually see human exceptionalism discarded, you're like, I kind of like dignity, I kind of like rights. And that brings up, you had it on your list, and I definitely want to talk to you about this, as I was looking forward to this conversation with you, artificial intelligence. And the AI thing. I've got some thoughts, but I want to hear what you think about that.
I know I'm sure you have some thoughts. I find myself talking more about algorithmic intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. And I find that's more helpful because the artificial intelligence is freighted with the illusion of self-consciousness, with the illusion of intentionality. And rather than the algorithmic dynamics, which in very sophisticated ways are now moving in ways that the creators of these systems, by the way, are now terrified. And many of them, too late, said, we want to control it. Too late, that thing's out of the bag, and you're not going to be able to control it. So now you can see it as a force. It's almost like the 2001 syndrome here with HAL, the HAL 9000 computer, and that effective AI response to saying, no, Dave, I'm not going to open up the pod bay door. And so that idea, and Asimov, iRobot, and all these understandings of how the thing can actually develop. So it's not a neutral thing, but it can be used in creative, effective manners. And that's where I see it. I agree with John Lennox in his 2084, where he's seeing that we don't want to ascribe to it the kind of consciousness where you're going to, as many people will say, Ray Kurzweil, he gushingly talks about the singularity,
Yeah.
where it's going to be greater. But it's not going to be that, but it'll be something else that it's actually the unintended consequences are rather chilling in some ways. But I think it's the technology, the second Tower of Babel.
Yeah. Well, look, I think that we're thinking along the same lines there a lot, because I think it's possible, and this, of course, I think there's a lot of historical precedent for materialists, particularly those that have really embraced scientism as a way of thinking about life in the world, to overestimate what it is that AI will do, but also what it is currently.
I think that's
right.
I
mean, I loved just a couple weeks ago, I don't know if you saw this, but after the Golden State Warriors lost the play-in game to the playoffs this year, and Klay Thompson went 0 for 9, they talked about how many bricks he threw up. And so AI picked it up and ran a story about how Klay Thompson had vandalized an arena by throwing bricks at it. Didn't quite get it exactly, right.
Quite right. Yeah,
and so, it has so much to do about, what sources of information these computers are pulling from, and there'll be an overestimation, because for materialists, there's nothing more to the human brain than the stuff. So if you have the stuff, you can mimic the human brain, but that just doesn't explain love. It doesn't explain the eternity in our hearts. It doesn't explain the human imagination that is so godlike in a very real way. On the other hand, I don't think we should underestimate how quickly technology morphs and changes, because it has. I remember coming across an SNL opening monologue from about maybe 6 or 7 years ago, where a comedian said, how much time we spend proving to robots that we're not robots, talking about that was 5 or 6 years ago. And I started to actually think about how much more time we interact with artificial intelligence and the good that it can do. Yes. And I don't think we should underestimate what God says about the Tower of Babel. I think there was a sense, that God didn't like tall buildings. And so that's why he, tore that project down. But what really, you remember, basically, he kind of almost, the narrative kind of presents it as if he's looking on the project of Babel. And of course, they had disobeyed. God wanted them to spread out over all the earth, and they had gathered together. So they had disobeyed there. But it almost like he looks on with curiosity, and then remember the pronouncement is, if as one people speaking one language, they think of it, they'll be able to do it. So I'm going to divide the language. It's an act of mercy. It both says that God still has his hand in human history. The whole thing's not going to blow up. All hope is never lost, because God is not disconnected in some sort of Epicurean way from his world. But it also says a lot about human capacity, that if we can do almost anything that comes into our mind, and by the way, we shouldn't do everything that comes into our mind. And that's the creation fall tension that we have to hold together, I think.
Yeah, there's a tensioned interplay.
Yeah.
I think that the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat, and there's reasons for that. But at the same time, let us build a thing so reaching up into heaven, so the hubris of a project that would achieve things that are denied to them, because he said, no, you're to spread out. So he has to confuse their language. And the wonderful irony of Pentecost is that it reverses Babel.
It does, doesn't it? And it reverses it in the spirit, because in a sense, science has reversed Babel, right?
Yes.
But not in a redemptive way, not in a way that deals with the sinful human condition.
That's correct. So what you now have, though, are new forms. And so I think about I have a little list I've created of 6 technological revolutions.
Okay.
And the first one is the agriculture. If you just think about a straight line, the human condition is pretty much flat for almost its entirety until just the last few centuries. Within the numbers in the 17th century was the agricultural revolution, which led to the industrial revolution of the 18th century, which is, so each one, all of a sudden that little curve starting to move up a little bit. Now it's going to become exponential, though, as we get to the electrical revolution of the 19th century. And then we get to the nuclear revolution of the early and late 20th centuries. And then the digital revolution, the fifth revolution of the 20th century. And then the sixth one is the quantum revolution, where you now are going to move into artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and fusion power. And so nothing will be impossible for them to accomplish, the claim would be, because it's gone up exponentially and it's gone up quicker than even people anticipated. Rather than wringing my hands in despair, I see it as a time of really the fulfillment of all things, as our Lord is saying, that his kingdom would come and his will would be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Oh, I love that analysis. I think it tells more of the story. I've really thought a lot about Thomas Friedman's take on the world is flat, where he really goes from the Industrial Revolution to the Information Revolution.
Yeah,
you're adding more detail there. That's really important to see, because it does make it more obvious.
It is. And so if it is exponential, but it's reaching and it's not going to be an S curve. It's going to continue up. There's only so much time that one has left. But I seek to live my life with a sense of urgency. We have a window of opportunity, but without anxiety.
Yeah.
And it's that lovely tension there, because we have a peace because God is on his throne.
Yeah.
And the king reigns, and he raised up kings and he deposes them. And he's told us about these kinds of things that would occur.
Yeah. But still, and it's interesting, this is one of the beauties of a Christian worldview. We're not fatalist, right? We're not, we believe the human, that our actions actually have real consequences.
Yes.
I've often been kind of come back to the line that Leslie Newbegin talks about in a lot of his books. He's quoting a Hindu a Hindu scholar. Of course, he was a missionary in India, came and became a Western missiologist, an Anglican.
That's right.
But he said, this Hindu scholar once said, I don't understand why you Christians talk about the Bible as if it's a book of religion, because what it describes is the whole history of the human race.
Yes.
And the human person as a responsible human actor in that story.
That's correct.
And you kind of look at it and you go, well, that is true. It is unique in the books of religion by talking about a history of all things, all people, but also still positing providence, a personal providence, but also the human actor as our actions and our thoughts still meaning something. It's really a unique story.
It is a unique story, and it's more comprehensive, coherent, clear, and consistent than any other story. But it has a fourth act coming, and that fourth act is going to be the redemption of all things, the consummation of all things. And I love that, because that's what makes it a comedy.
Yeah,
it's going to end well.
That's right. The resolution's perfect. That's good.
Yeah. So it's both a comedy and it's also a romance, because this one who's a personal agent is also not only given us the dignity of responsibility, but whose choices do matter.
Yeah.
And they're not just kismet or fatalism or determinism, yet the awful risk of that freedom that would be underwritten by the one who made us.
Yeah.
So it's the astonishing concept that the infinite word who puts a face on space and on infinity and eternity becomes the incarnate word, so he could become the indwelling word. There's no story like
There's no story like that.
It's not only a romance. It's not only a romance. It's a comedy. It's the ultimate rom-com.
I love that.
Yeah. Hey, it's been fun to be with you.
Oh, listen, as always, I'm so grateful for your work. It's been a big part of kind of my growth. I just love the diversity of things that you're able to put together and help people follow the Lord and do it in such a real way. Really, really grateful for it. This has been a super fun conversation.
I enjoy it and look forward to our next one.
All right, absolutely.
You're a blessed brother, and I love how you think and how you live. And it's the integration of being, of knowing and doing, of loving well, learning well, and living well. It's what we all want to pursue.
God bless you, my friend.
Thank you.
Thank you for being a part of the Explorers podcast. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.